What is going on, everyone? This middle game lesson today is going to be about passed pawns, and some of these ideas can be applied to the endgame as well. We're going to look at several examples to understand the strengths and weaknesses of a passed pawn, which squares we need to control as we advance these pawns forwards, which pieces serve as good blockaders and which ones are horrible blockaders, and as a bonus, I'm going to show you how we can turn an outside passed pawn in the endgame into a victory, and we're starting right now. My name is Alex. Welcome to avchesslab, where I make chess fun and easy for everyone to understand. The middle game is the most crucial aspect of the chess game and by far the most difficult one to understand. I will try to provide as many examples with details as possible so that you can become a master as well. It is also very important before we jump into the examples to have a good opening foundation in order to have a good middle game, and also to have a good transition from the middle game to the end game so that we can finish off our opponents. Let's jump into it. Okay, we have our first example here. It is black to play, and honestly, the position looks really bad. We are hitting the queen with a knight. This queen is pinning the rook here, is also attacking this queen. The bishop on the a is pinned by the rook, but black does have something very useful here, and it's this little pawn on e3. It is a very advanced pawn. It's only 2 squares away from queening. So what can black play here? Well, not pawn to e2. As I mentioned, the queen on d7 is pinned. So if we push this pawn forward right now, we can go ahead, take the queen, and after we get a queen here, this rook comes back, attacks our queen. Also notice that this queen is coming to e8 with check. This rook is going to have to go back, and we're going to take that with checkmate. So this is not possible. So let's return to the original position and see what else black can do. Here, black can go ahead and try to take this queen first. But my friends, this doesn't work either because of a little tactical sequence. We can take the bishop with check first, and after the rook covers, we take with check, the king takes, and now we're able to take the queen with check, and after the king moves, this knight is able to get back with enough time to prevent this pawn from queening, because now we are protecting the queening square with a knight. So this doesn't work either. So what else can we do in this situation? Well, tip number 1 that I'm going to give you guys is always be aware of tactics. We know that this pawn is very advanced and it's only 2 squares away from queening. And notice that none of the white pieces can actually get to that pawn. So what black needed to do here was to take on c8, and after queen takes, now we push the pawn forward. When the queen takes on d8, we check, we go back with the rook. Now we're hitting the queen, so the queen gives a check on d5, the king moves, and notice there's nothing that can stop this pawn. The game actually continued with knight to e6. Black got a queen with check, the king went to a2, and this position is absolutely fine for black. It is equal, and he can force a draw here with queen to b4, and after knight takes, queen a4, king b1, and queen to d1, it will be a perpetual check. In this next example, it is white to play, and we're up a pawn, and notice it is a very important pawn. It's this passed pawn here on d5 that's ready to march forward and promote itself into a queen. Now, there's a couple things we can do here with white. We can go ahead and play passively and start protecting our pawn here on b2 that is being attacked by the queen, or we can go ahead and play more actively, and this is where tip number 2 comes in. Use your heavy pieces like the rook and queen to support the pawn, especially from behind. So here, rook to d1 is the best move to play. Now, the pawn is protected by both the rook and the queen and is ready to start advancing forward. If black here in this exact position wants any counterplay, he has to take on b2. Here we play d6. Now we're ready to go to d7 and attack the rook as well. So the rook comes to d8. And here we're going to centralize our queen, put another heavy piece behind the pawn. Now we have 2 supporters. This pawn's ready to come to d7. And this is exactly how we win these positions. Once our pawn reaches the 7th rank, we're going to tie up the opponent's pieces to the protection of the pawn. And once that happens, then we can start going ahead and collecting all the material from the board, or at least improving our position. This next example is probably the most instructive one. It is black to play, and notice that both sides have a passed pawn. The only difference is that black's passed pawn is only 1 square away from queening, while the white passed pawn here on the square on d5 still needs 3 turns to queen. So for this reason, black retains the advantage. I'm just going to go ahead and give you the tip for this one. it is probably the best tip you're going to learn in this lesson. And that is tip number 3, the queen is the worst blockader. Here, black can just win tactically by playing queen takes on c1, queen takes, and now this queen is forced to the protection of this pawn. And this pawn is protected by our bishop. So we can go ahead now and move our rook to b8. And once this rook from here moves anywhere, we're going to go ahead, play rook to b1. The queen's going to be pinned. We're going to win the game very easily. This game actually continued with bishop to e4, rook capture on b4, bishop took on c2, and here after rook to c4, with the pinning of the bishop, there was nothing else to play for, and it was a very easy win for black. This example here is one of my favorite ones, and it's a very famous game. It was played between Nigel Short and Alexei Shirov back in 2002 in a rapid game. It is white to play, and notice that white is down a piece, but he does have a very strong passer here on e6. Unfortunately for Short in the game, he ended up playing rook to g1, which was a very bad move, and he ended up losing the game. Now, this pawn that's on e6, yes, it's a passed pawn, but as you can see, it is very hard to keep pushing this pawn forward. This knight protects the square, and this queen is also protecting the square if we keep advancing it. Not to mention, this rook is hitting our rook here. And if we decide to capture the rook, then we get queen to e1, and after the rook returns to f1, it will be queen takes on f1 with checkmate. So how do we actually win this game with white and the move that Nigel Short missed? Well, we're going to use a combination of 2 previous tips I've already given you. Tip number 1, which was to be aware of tactics when you have a passed pawn, and tip number 2, which was to provide support, especially with your heavy pieces such as your rooks and queens. So the move that needed to be played in this position by Short was to go queen to f7 and check. Now this rook is not longer taking our rook, so if the king decides to move, you'll probably get checkmated, or worse, we're going to go ahead and capture the rook ourselves. So the best move for black is to capture a queen, but after we take with the pawn, there is nothing that black can do to prevent this pawn from queening. He's going to have to go back with his queen, but then after we get a queen, queen takes, rook takes, and after we take on f8, white is completely winning up the exchange and a couple of pawns. I really like this example because you will get to play this theme over and over in all your games. The tip for this example is that knights are good blockaders, but they serve as horrible defenders. So what do I mean by that? Well, we can play rook takes b2 here. And after knight takes b2, we can go ahead and play c3, attacking the knight. Now, notice something really cool here. If the knight goes to d3, then we can go ahead and throw this c4 move with a discovered check on the king. After the rook captures our bishop, we can take the knight, and there's nothing this rook can do about these 2 pawns. It is completely hopeless. One of these 2 pawns is going to become a queen and win the game. So that is not possible. So after the move c3, instead of going knight to d3, white continue with rook takes on b6. And now both pieces are hanging. We can take here and we can take there. If we take one of these 2 pieces, black actually loses. So the way to win this was to go pawn to c4, controlling this very beautiful square here on d3. Now the knight cannot come here, and we are ready to push our pawn forward to the queenie square. This is why knights are horrible defenders. They're good blockaders, horrible defenders. Here, white continue with rook to b4 with a very nice trick. Now c2 doesn't work because we can capture on c4, and once the rook gets behind the pawn, we can just capture on the next move. But of course, black didn't do any of this. He played a5 instead. And in this position, white resigned because after knight takes on c4, then we play c2. And notice this knight, a really horrible defender, cannot get back to the protection. This rook cannot get to c4 because the knight stands in the way. And it cannot go to b1 because if it does that, well, we just take it with a pawn and win the game like that. Now, after a5, if the rook takes on c4, then, my friends, we take on b2. We're ready to queen on the next move. This rook here cannot go to c1 because we take it. And the reason why a5 was such a beautiful move is that now the rook cannot come to b4 because then this pawn can just take the rook and game over. To further highlight the idea that knights are horrible defenders, let's look at this position here. White is down a piece, but we have a very important advanced pass pawn here. So that's only 2 squares away from queening. Now, if we try to push now, well, the square on c7 is well protected by both the bishop and the knight. And if we do that, it would just be a draw. So the way to win here is to take this bishop, and now after knight takes, we can push our pawn forward. And look at this. We're ready to take, we're ready to push. There's nothing this lonely knight can do to prevent this pawn from becoming a queen on the next move. It will either queen by itself or just capture the knight on b8. In this next example, the tip will be that the blockading piece loses its mobility. What do I mean by that? All right, in this position, black is up a pawn, this pass pawn here, and it's only a few squares from queening, but it is well blockaded by this knight on c3. And not only that, the pawn, the material that we're up, this knight is actually ready to take on e4. And once it captures there, just come back to c3 and blockade our pawn again. So how does black make progress here? Well, we're going to take advantage of the fact that this knight has to always stay vigilant of this pawn. And it cannot actually move from here because it is queening very fast. So how do we do this? So we're going to play knight to d3, giving away the e4 pawn. The knight captures, and here we play knight to c1, giving away another pawn. G takes on f3, and here we play knight to a2, and with our knight now, we are controlling the c3 square. So once we push the pawn, this knight's gonna have to sacrifice itself, and then we win it back. Notice that this king is not fast enough. If the king goes there, we go up. King here, we go up again. King here, we get our queen because this knight is also protecting the queening square. Now there's another variation here. If instead of g takes on f3, after knight c1, what if this knight comes back to c3? Well, we have this very nice move, knight check. It's a fork, and you have to capture the knight. Otherwise, the game is over on the spot. We're just going to capture on c3. But if you do capture the knight, we capture with a pawn, and again, we're about to queen, and this king cannot actually stop the pawn, so it is game over. All right, you made it this far into the video, and as I promised you, I have a nice little bonus for you. But before we get to that, I wanted to go over the tips again, just so that you get a better understanding of them. Tip number 1 was to be aware of tactics. And what this means is that you can have a very advanced pass pawn, and your position might look absolutely horrible. In these situations, look for some kind of combination, some kind of tactic that will allow you to push the pawn forward while your opponent is distracted, trying to prevent you from achieving some other goal somewhere else in the board. Tip number 2 was to provide support to your pass pawn. What this means is that you're going to put a heavy piece, such as a rook or queens, behind your pawn. You're going to march that pawn up the board, and once it reaches the 7th rank, your opponent is going to be tied up. He will not be able to move, and when that happens, you go ahead and you capture the pieces around and you win the game. Tip number 3, the queen is the worst blockader. This makes sense. The queen is our most valuable piece. We give it a value of 9 points, and we don't want that piece blocking a pawn from moving forward. We want that piece in the middle of the board, attacking other things with many threats. If it has to blockade a pawn, it's not doing her job. Tip number 4, knights are good blockaders, but very bad defenders. If we put a knight behind a pawn, preventing that pawn from moving forward, that is ideal. But if the knight is on the side where a pawn can attack it, well, in that case, we can attack the pawn and advance the pawn at the same time, making the knight a horrible defender of the passed pawn. Tip number 5, the blockading piece loses its mobility. What this means is that a piece might be distracted trying to prevent the pawn from going forward, and in this case, we can use our extra piece to actually maneuver all around the board and actually create threats and win the game for ourselves, while the blockading piece has to stay around the pawn. If it leaves, push the pawn forward, we get a queen, we win the game. All right, let's jump into the bonus example. So we have this endgame, and the material is even. Both sides have 3 pawns, and actually black is the only one that has a passed pawn here. But the way to win this with white is to create a passed pawn, and in this case, it will be using these 2 pawns that we have here against this one to create a passer. The way we do this is that we push this pawn forward, and then it will continue to move forward until we reach the queening square. Now, black here with the king is going to try and prevent this from happening, and he's going to start marching the king towards that side to prevent this pawn from queening. When that happens, well, in that case, we bring our king forward, we start taking this pawn, we come take this other pawn, and then our little savior here, he's going to march down the board and win the game for us. So let's see what that looks like. We push the pawn, black takes, white takes, the king comes here. Again, we can push the pawn, but it doesn't matter. At this point, the black king is going to come here. We're going to march forward with the king. King takes, king takes. This king is going to rush to the other side now and try to prevent us from getting a queen, but that's not going to work. After these moves, we are just going to control this square. We're going to push this pawn forward, win the game. And guys, this is how you do it. This is how you create a pass pawn and win the endgame. Hope you enjoyed this lesson. Check out one of the videos on the screen. As always, stay safe, have a great day, show respect to your opponent. See you on the next video.